India Space Policy, a watershed moment. Track 2 will be conducted in RBR Hall 1, Satellites for Effective Disaster Risk Reduction. Track 3, RBR 2, on Satellite Mobile Convergence. And Track 4 will be conducted in RBR 3, above the Kármán line, leveraging microgravity. May we request all those who wish to attend Track 1 on India Space Policy, a watershed moment, to kindly grace the seats in this hall. We would request you all who are interested in attending India Space Policy, a watershed moment, to kindly take their seats in this hall, which is Track 1. May we request everybody to be seated as soon as possible. Together to welcome Dr. P.K. Jain, our distinguished chair, Director PMAD in Space, our moderator, Professor Chaitanya Giri, Associate Professor, Flame University, Editor, Interstellar and Go and Consultants, RIS. A warm welcome to the moderator. I also have the privilege in inviting our eminent speakers. I invite Mr. Shivaji Chatterjee, Executive Vice President, Hughes Communications India Pvt. Limited. Warm welcome to you, sir. I invite Captain Vishal Kanwar, Executive Director, PwC India. Warm welcome. I invite Mr. Abhishek Malhotra, Managing Partner, TMT Law Practice. A warm welcome to you, sir. I invite Mr. Sherille Ismail, Associate General Counsel, Intelsat. Warm welcome. May I invite Mr. Kaushik Moitra, Partner, Bharucha Partners. Warm welcome to you, sir. I invite Ms. Seema Jhingan, Senior Partner and Co-Founder, LexCounsel. Warm welcome to you, ma'am. And Mr. Sriram Ananthayanam, Partner, Deloitte, India. Ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome to Session 1 on India Space Policy, a watershed moment. The India Space Policy 2023 marks a watershed moment in India's space sector. The comprehensive policy framework emphasizes the importance of commercialization, private sector participation, and technology transfer, creating a conducive environment for startups and businesses to thrive. And ladies and gentlemen, the time duration for the session on India Space Policy, a watershed moment, is approximately 1 hour 20 minutes, which includes the opening and closing remarks by the chair and moderated presentations, addresses by our distinguished moderator. So may I now hand over to our chair for the opening remarks and to be carried forward by the moderator. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, and good afternoon to all of you. The distinguished speakers on the dais, dear delegates, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very pleased today to be here in this Indian Space Congress, participating in the discussions on the very relevant topic, the Indian Space Policy 2023. The first disclaimer, which when I was talking to the Professor Chaitanya Giri, that today I will speak or limit myself to describing the Indian Space Policy 2023 and will not be a judgmental or provide the recommendation or the analysis, which I leave that particular part to the fellow speakers. Because InSpace was part of the exercise in drafting the policy and then taking the approval from the government. So it would be fair that I confine myself to describing the policy. So as you all aware, the policy was approved by the government in April after a relatively long wait period. But it came out a very concise document. You know that it's around 7 pages if you exclude the initial definition or the index and all. Very concise document, and to the possible extent, I believe that it reflects or it manifests the government intention in bringing out the space sector reforms in letter and spirit. And that I would underline in highlighting the 5 important points or 5 important features of the policy. Number 1, it is comprehensive. Comprehensive in the sense that it covers almost all the verticals of the space sector, be it satellite, launch, the application, ground segment, the space situational awareness, the mining of the space mining, outer space, taking outer space missions. So basically all upstream, downstream, midstream, entire all the facets of the space sectors are addressed in the policy. The second thing is, it also enables the private entities to participate in the space activity or become a co-traveler in true sense. Because almost everything in the space activity, nothing is left, which the private entities cannot do or cannot participate now in India. Again, be it the manufacturing of the satellite or establishment and operations of the satellite, launching it, creating your own launch base, or the ground segment, or even the participating in the taking up the development and research activity. So almost everything the private entities now can participate, even providing the services outside India, using the Indian or non-Indian orbital resources. So everything is made possible, enabled, even they can make their own ITU filing also. So this is the second important feature. The third thing was that the very clearly, unambiguously, the role and responsibility of all the stakeholders are defined. Whether it is InSpace, Department of Space, NCIL, ISRO, it's a very well defined. So the clarity exists and there is no confusion. InSpace has been given the role of authorizer and supervisor, again in line with the Article 6 of the Outer Space Treaty, which says that for any space activity in a country, especially if taken up by now the private entities, there has to be some authorization and supervisor, and the InSpace has been given that role. Similarly, at the same time, they are enabling and promoting the private entities to strengthen the space sector. Again, that InSpace has been given that role. And similarly, the ISRO's focus on the human space flight, taking the outer space missions, or especially the focus on the R&D, NCIL being the taking the commercialization of the government resources and then the technology, Department of Space being the implementation body. So roles are very clearly defined. The fourth thing is, again, attempts are made to make it more futuristic and far-fetching, in the sense that what all the factors which are important for the growth and sustenance of the space sector in the country, everything has been addressed. For example, the focus is also, if you see the vision and the strategy of the policy, that the focus is on the Indian space economy, strengthening the Indian space economy through participation of the, again, private entities in the entire value chain of the Indian space economy. The focus is on the, again, research and development through ISRO, rightly so, because ISRO is has a lot of expertise and the capability to pursue the R&D. Of course, not at the, again, the private entities are not barred for taking up the research and development, but again, ISRO will focus on the research and development. And similarly, if you see the again focus is on the pursuing the international relations, the scientific temperament, building up the scientific temperament, and the space situational awareness. So nothing is left. Actually, all the facets are covered. And again, the another important thing was the optimum utilization and the acquisition protection of the spectrum, which is again important resource. So that is also has been addressed in the policy, and who will do what. The fourth thing is pursuing the international relation, which is very, very important, and enough emphasis has been made. And for the growth of the space sector in the country, this is another important activity, because without the collaboration with the other countries, we cannot really grow the economy. So this is how we can see the Indian Space Policy 2023 has been drafted carefully, addressing all these aspects. Now, coming to what should be the next step. So, InSpace has already started working along with Department of Space on the working out the guidelines for the implementation of the policy, and we have also released a draft for the few of the authorization and seeking the comments. Inputs have been received, and we will be working on that. Another thing which we have been getting the views from many people, and I am sure that some of the experts sitting here also will talk about what is the legal sanctity, or what happens to the Indian Space Bill or Act. So certainly that is the next step for the government to do it. FDI policy is another important topic which is being discussed. It is at its last leg of the approval. So we will be working on together for taking this Indian space policy implementation forward. And now I will be keen to listen to the views and recommendations of the experts sitting here to take it further forward. Thank you very much.
Hello everyone. This is the second Indian Space Congress. In the previous iteration of this particular event, we had already discussed the great potential that has been unleashed because of the space reforms of 2020. The reforms have been embellished by a national geospatial policy. Now the Indian space policy, there are a few policy documents in place, in the works, and we now are sort of very proud of the 100+ startups that have emerged in the past few years. Along with that, the vendors, the classical vendors of the Indian space program, they have also sort of rolled up their sleeves, and they are now ready to make those global collaborations. A lot of these collaborations are in the works again, and things are looking bright. But I'm not here representing the public sector, neither am I the private sector. As an academician, sitting besides consultants, stalwarts who are heading the large SATCOM companies, lawyers, I'm here to push for a better penetration of these reforms into the space ecosystem. And when I say penetration, what I mean is we need standard operating procedures now for all the verticals that encompass this ecosystem. And these verticals are much, much deeper and wider than what we have classically classified them as: remote sensing, SATCOM, human spaceflight, and so forth. We need more intricate policies, we need more intricate workings, and such intricate workings cannot be deliberated, nor can they be formulated without frank conversations. So setting the tone and tenor of this event, I'm here requesting everyone to have those frank conversations, because out of such conversations will only we'll be able to generate really sound outputs for Indian space ecosystem. We are going global. The Artemis Accords that we have signed is testimony to it. We are still maintaining our strategic autonomy. So there is a lot of balancing to be done. And as we find the right balance, that right balance is asking us for franker conversations. So here's to the frank conversations that we'd like to have in this particular session. And I'll open up to the lawyers first. Let them not have the last word. So starting with Seema ji.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm a lawyer, but I'll make the policy that I'm going to be discussing as simple, as understandable as possible. So I'm going to come in with a lot of experience of mine in the last 20 years in my experience of dealing with satellite. So let me start with, there was a tectonic shift in 2020. The government suddenly decided, not suddenly, it was been working on it, but they decided that we are going to change our mindscape on the way we are dealing with and encouraging the satellite space. So what they did was they came up with this policy, which we're going to be discussing today, which enabled and which intended to create services in the satellite area and make it open to private sector. So my entire focus of the 5 minutes I'll be speaking will be on how the private industry or the private sector can come into the space sector, which was unheard and unbelievable maybe just 7 to 8 years back. Now, what they did was they brought in the InSpace in 2020, where Mr. Jain is leading that organization. And they intended to create this InSpace as a separate regulatory and authorization entity, so that the government is not stepping into directly as ISRO or DOS. This was the previous, when I was dealing directly with ISRO, I saw a lot of conflict of interest at the point of time. The entity which is running the show in terms of commercializing the space industry and also authorizing private industry to do the space sector initiatives. So there was a conflict of interest. So they have created this autonomous body under the aegis of the Department of Space directly. And in 2023, recently, they have come up with a very simple and straightforward policy on space, which sort of gives the contours to what would be the way forward. There has been a lot of criticism on the government that there hasn't been a clear policy. We had a SATCOM policy which was brought in 1997. And that was just a 3-pager. It was very bare bone, and we didn't know. As a lawyer, I did not know how to advise my clients, what is the way forward in submitting the application, what would be the time involved, and will the government be receptive to go forward with your applications. And that was followed with norms and guidelines in 2000. Again, very sketchy, I would say. There was a lot of activity there, I would be honest, but mostly towards canalizing of foreign satellite capacity to India. So I had the opportunity of working with SES Americom, with Protostar, with Mabuhay, and several other satellite companies. But these were foreign satellite operators coming to India and wanting to lease their capacity in India. Now, there was an initiative that you can set up your own Indian satellite systems in India. But the implementation was shaky, and I've represented an ERA. I don't know if they're there in the audience here right now. But we went through a lot of hassles in getting the government accept our applications because, and I'll spell out my own experience. The reasons were they were cautious. There was national security element to it. They have never done that before. ISRO had the monopoly of leading the entire space sector. And there were also issues related to orbital slot. Now, that was a huge scale task. Now, first of all, the Indian satellite or orbital slots were very difficult to obtain. And if you're bringing the outside international orbital slots, then the radio interference, the issues with the WPC, the challenging the entire experience of getting the approval through the WPC was time consuming. Now, I've done that, so I'm speaking from experience that it was an uphill task, to say the least, to get the government to authorize and enable the non-Indian orbital slots to provide services in India, which is happily going to change now. And I see the difference in the policy then and the policy now and the approach. And I will just focus on what this policy is going to do for the private sector. Now, first of all, it is enabling end-to-end services. Basically, from upstream to downstream, end-to-end services to the private sector to come to India, or be the Indian entrepreneurs and set up the Indian entities. Everything will be done through the Indian entity, whether you are providing foreign satellite operators or you want to be an Indian satellite and set up a satellite system. You have to set up an Indian entity in India for doing that. And it will enable you to do a spectrum of things. It includes providing services from geostationary satellites or non-geostationary satellites in India. You can do these services through Indian orbital slots or non-Indian orbital slots. You can set up telemetry tracking systems, earth stations, satellite control systems. The policy is very forward-looking in also allowing the Indian private operators to mine asteroids and do asteroid resources possession, bring them back into India, evacuation and transportation. It's an uphill task, that's a different story. But the government is enabling and providing that right to the Indian operators to do that and be part of the space exploration. I think that is a real step forward. Then they have also enabled you to create launch pads and satellite systems and launching shuttles, which is interesting. So basically the entire spectrum is available. They've also stepped back. They've also stepped back as ISRO from doing the commercial activities, and they have gone into a higher role of doing research and development, which is very high intensity in terms of capital. They're also going to be doing education, and space innovative technologies, which is interesting because now they will not be directly competing with the private sector. The interesting bit is the consumers. Unlike previously where everything had to be canalized through ISRO, the private sector can directly reach to consumers. The Indian consumers of these services have the option of going to the private sector or going to these to the government entities. Government entity will be the commercial wing of the government entity will be led by Indian Space, which will be leading the commercialization aspect of the ISRO technologies. Now, interestingly, which will be of more interest to you, last week, 4-5 days back, InSpace has come out with an authorization norms. These are the guidelines. There's some interesting observations that I have, and what I see is there is an enablement created there, but there is also, and Mr. Jain, I'll be a little more open here with my comments. They have also been, again, there is an element of a lot of cautiousness, a lot of, I will have control over you, I will ensure that you listen to me, you will report to me, and I'll come in a bit on those issues. But let me go into the authorization guidelines as such. Basically, you need to understand, you may have a company, but if you have a space object, which is what they are calling it, the satellite system if they're going out to space, every authorization will be per space object. So if you change any contours, or if you're bringing in the new space object or new space application or new application for the space technology, you will have to go for this fresh authorization. The same authorization will not be valid. Second, the authorization will be valid for a particular period. So you are supposed to implement the authorization enablement that has been given to you within that period, and there may be some extensions. It's not mentioned, must be mentioned, may be mentioned in the authorization they give you. The third is, which is very important if you're a foreign investor in India, that two aspects. One is if there is any change in control of the Indian entity, which they call as non-government entity, NGE. If there's any change in control, which is 51% and more, then the authorization will be freshly required, because they perceive that we gave the approval to a entity and that entity's face and promoters and founders have changed, so therefore come back to us. So any structuring that you need to do, come to the lawyers first in terms of investments into the company, and then go forward and take the authorization, because otherwise you'll have to go through the process again. The third is, which I definitely find very draconian, is which is that if there is any non-compliance of the authorization, your authorization will be null and void. And what does that mean basically is that you wouldn't be given, at least that's how the guideline reads. And I'm sure Mr. Jain will clarify that. If you have not complied with any aspect of the authorization, your authorization will be ipso facto die. So basically, you must have invested hundreds of millions of dollars into the entity. You may have launched the satellite, but if there is any non-violation, there's a violation and a breach, your authorization can be termed as null and void, which means it doesn't exist. So be very careful with the compliance bit. The other bit is that the 4.5 months that they say will be taking to authorize you to do which is a license that will be given to you, is from the date of subject to completion of all your formalities in terms of giving the right information, and also getting internal approvals from different departments. So while this is a once place that you will go, which is the InSpace for getting your approvals, but InSpace would internally coordinate with different administrations and different departments to come back with their comments on because it will be a collaborative effort, because it's definitely more sensitive than just setting up a manufacturing unit. So there would be elements of national security and international relations involved here, so you will be liable to be, and I'll come in a bit of what your liability could be. So there would be all of those elements as well. There is going to be a third-party liability insurances that you will be required to do, and the assessment of how much that liability insurance you have to take will be done by InSpace based on the maximum probable loss. So that would be the minimum starting point for you to have the liability insurance. The other interesting bit is if you're a foreign satellite operator and want to provide your bandwidth here, Indian entity would be required. You no longer can come and canalize your leases through the ISRO. You will have to work through your authorized representative or your Indian entity or a subsidiary in India. So that's interesting, because that's what we used to be doing, directly going and interacting with ISRO. I think I'll stop here so that others can speak, but there would be other elements in the policy which we can discuss later in the day. Yeah.
Thank you, Seema ji. Apart from lawyers, we have consultants, and that's the cohort that Indian private sector players are consistently talking to. They have been helping in creating that enabling environment, bringing in investments, showing them the path ahead. And as this policy document came out, a very broad and a very succinctly put out document, yet there are quite a few questions that are arising. These questions are not related to the document or what should have been in it or out of it, but it is more so about getting again into the nitty-gritties, the point that I mentioned earlier. So I invite Sriram to make a comment on the policy document and bring forth his views.
Sure, thank you. And good afternoon. As a consultant, I stand here as the voice of a lot of private sector, space sector players who we've been speaking to. So most of the comments that I'm going to make are basis what what I'm hearing from the market in terms of specific asks from the policy and from the various government entities who are involved. No doubt that this policy is a watershed moment, like telecom regulations, or when the telecom sector was privatized, and 20 years later we now see what is happening and where we are. So perhaps another 20-25 years, space sector would be one of the largest sectors in the country from a business perspective. Specifically looking at the policy, like Dr. Jain said, a lot of groundwork has been enabled in terms of who is going to do what. From a consultant lingo, it is a RACI matrix has been set up. Who is responsible, who is accountable, who is going to be consulted, who is going to be informed in terms of the various activities. However, like Professor Giri said, what is lacking in that, and like the other speaker also said, 2 or 3 areas. One, certain conflicts of interest, which have potential conflicts of interest, or what the players can see as potential conflicts of interest, should be resolved. For example, there is one statement that says the Department of Space would work in terms of, if I were to read out, oversee the distribution of responsibilities and empower the different stakeholders while ensuring they don't overlap. But perhaps when the Department of Space itself has got a huge ISRO influence, so that is like a minor conflict of interest that is creeping into the policy, so to speak. So likewise, there could be other areas. I'm not spelling out. I'm sure other lawyers would have seen that. That is point number one. Point number two, like Professor Giri said, the standard operating procedure. The policy has said what it is. It has probably stayed away from the how and the when and who will do what when. Now, unless and until that gets clarified, perhaps in the bill that Dr. Jain said, once that clarity comes in, there will be a much more uptake in terms of activities, so to speak. The other point, if you look at is, every industry has a kind of a regulator, and we have seen what TRAI has done to telecom sector, what DGCA and AI have done to aviation sector, so on and so forth. So perhaps a little more teeth to in space in terms of a regulatory teeth when it comes from the Space Activity Bill would again further propel this sector much forward. In terms of some of the timelines, it said that ISRO will slowly transition into research and development while leaving the commercial activities to the private player. How, when, who will do what is going to be the timeline? Those are kind of things which, when better laid out by ISRO, by the regulators, would really provide an impetus to the private sector players. Not just the existing private sector players, but many of them who are aspiring startups, and many of foreign institutional investors who want to really invest into the Indian private sector players are asking some of these questions. So answers to many of these would really help catalyze the system, if I may use that word, to take it to, pun intended, higher orbit. Thank you.
Thank you. We have with us 2 major SATCOM companies, and while we talk to them, they have been in India for a very long time. They have been working with a lot of strategic and non-strategic end users. Yet at the same time, they are now at the precipice of something really big. And as was put out by some of the speakers over here, they are now looking out for partners with whom they can collaborate, not only on the upstream, but also on the midstream. So there are satellite companies who are wanting to build satellites. They'll be looking up to these companies for providing those downstream services. And they'll be providing the satellites, the small sats. And yet at the same time, there is, as was mentioned, the telecom sector. The telecom sector is massive in India. And they are spreading their wings with every generation of telecom technology that is coming. And 6G happens to be where the competition lies. So where we have the SATCOM, the classical SATCOM providers like Hughes and Intelsat, yet at the same time you have the Airtels and the Jios of the world also penetrating into those markets. So to get their views, I'll invite Sherille, Ismail.
I'm going to I actually looked up the definition of watershed, and I think one of the things I learned is that watershed is something you define after it has happened. In other words, you look back and say, that was a watershed moment when things changed. The river went down the mountain, and there's no turning back. You can't go back upstream. What that suggests to me is 2 points I want to make very quickly. One is that it has to be a pivotal moment, and the second one is this is not the end, but just the beginning. In other words, a lot of important developments have yet to happen, and I think that's reflected in some of the comments we've heard. So I will address that in 2 areas. One is I'll make a few comments about what's been happening globally and how that could benefit the Indian economy in multiple ways. And second, I'll offer some thoughts on Dr. Jain's work and the chairman of InSpace, Pawan Goenka, who had been doing fantastic leadership in this area. So just a very few comments about Intelsat. We've been around for 60 years, 52 satellites with global coverage, 10 million terminals. We have worked in many global industry leaders, trusted by Indian industry in the media sector, in mobility, in networks, and in the Department of Defense as well. A few quick points. We've collaborated with ISRO going back 3 decades or so with joint payloads. We distribute something like half the TV content, and we have partnerships with Nelco to provide in-flight connectivity and Cloudcast to provide maritime connectivity, and we're looking to expand in all of these areas. We are building a unified global network, and a few features of this network are worth pointing out. I will primarily address 3 of them. First is, this is a change from hardware to software. We've built and will soon be operating 12 software-defined satellites. And the important point about this is that this offers the capability to allocate capacity dynamically. After the satellite is launched, you can change the beam shape. You can allocate capacity as needed on demand. You can change frequencies. Just superior connectivity, flexibility, seamless end-to-end networking. The second feature of this transformation in the technology at this moment is that it's a multi-orbit network. There is GEO, LEO, in fact, MEO and high-altitude platform systems, along with the terrestrial network. And the reason is no one orbit is perfect. Some have, LEO is much better for latency, but the security, maybe the GEO is better. And when you look at the overall economics, I think the GEO system is better. So in Intelsat, we have invested in a multi-orbit satellite network, and that's what we are investing our future in. The final area I want to mention is the smart edges. I'm guessing there's nobody here using a flip-top phone anymore. We all have these smartphones. And that's the level of change that will be possible with the software-defined networks. You have smart edge terminals, and this is a tremendous opportunity for the startup culture in India. They will be able to do things that we can't even imagine. I know, let me just turn very quickly to the space policy itself. 1 year ago, in June of 2022, the Honorable Prime Minister Modi did the ribbon-cutting ceremony at the InSpace headquarters in Ahmedabad. And he said at that time, he compared the future of the space sector to the IT sector, and he said, we'll rise to new heights. And at that time, he promised a policy of ease of doing business. And I will congratulate Dr. Jain and his team at InSpace for coming ahead and offering the guidelines that they issued last Friday. It's a tremendous start. It does aim, at least, to set up a level playing field. As he mentioned, the roles are well defined, and there's the promise of regulatory certainty. But I've been a regulator myself, and I know that putting things, allocating responsibilities on paper is just the beginning. There will still be agencies fighting with each other for turf and for responsibilities, and that has to happen. That you can't decide everything on paper. So this goes back to what a watershed moment we are in. There is still a lot of work to be done. In fact, it may be the guidelines themselves. We submitted comments to it last Friday. There are many areas in which there could be some changes and refinements. And I, again, congratulate you. I thank you for your transparency in inviting industry input into this process. I will comment on just two points that need more clarification. And one is the FDI rules. You mentioned them. The FDI rules, they're not handled by any of the agencies we talked about. They're handled by a different ministry. It's across the economy. But until those rules are issued, we cannot set up an Indian entity. We have 2 Indian entities already, but we don't know if they comply with the requirements that we just talked about. And the second one is, we would like to see some agency fight for the space sector when there are challenges that are threats. And I specifically mentioned the auctions proposal that has been advanced by TRAI. If spectrum is auctioned, it'll be a major blow to the satellite SATCOM sector, and we can address that in the Q&A. And I would encourage you to attend the session on Wednesday dealing with auction design. My colleague Hazem Moakit will be speaking there. But if there's any questions, and if we get another opportunity, I will comment on that as well. Thank you very much.
One of the attributes of a spacefaring country, a good spacefaring country, is that its regulatory system walks hand in hand with its technology sector. They are not far away from each other. They walk very close to each other. And that is what we need here in India. And conversations like these help a lot. Now, take for instance, one of the examples of the United States. You are seeing a lot of missions going to asteroids. We just heard about asteroid mining, space mining. And that is backed by something known as Space Resources Utilization Act. The Parliament is working in synchrony with the space missions. The regulatory sector is working in synchrony with it. We need that sort of synchronization across the ministerial board. And as Mr. Ismail mentioned, that there is another ministry which is taking charge of some of the aspects of allowing FDI. All these ministries need to work in unison. And I'm sure in the coming months and years, InSpace will look into that. As we proceed, I'll again go back to my lawyer friends. Kaushik is smiling. Kaushik, go ahead.
Hi, thank you, everyone. I think a lot has been said about the policy, so I'll not go back into describing the policy as such. I think Seema has already done a fairly comprehensive job of that. I'll keep it brief. The idea that we need to look at the moment is that this is still a policy. This is a policy, and therefore it may be a little premature to dissect it at this moment and kind of say that this particular part is not part of it, this is not written in it, or it doesn't address it, etc. I would like to just bring everybody to everybody's attention that when we say, and it's written in one of these, I think the booklet here says leveraging space to power the next gen communications and business, right? So space in that sense is the one thing that can actually touch pretty much every business around, whether in the metros or in the tier 2 or the tier 3. What is, however, important is to wait for the next level, especially the bill, and then the regulations that come in there. And if all of us here together on this panel and everybody here are able to make the ecosystem which is smooth, which allows people to come in and do business easily, and all that will not be found in the space policy really. And looking for that in the space policy is, I think, asking for a little too much. What is important, however, is what we've seen in some of the other special acts and policies where there's a lot more of advocacy, which automatically allows other sectors and other regulators to come back and mold their policies which work in sync with space policy, so that they can then derive the maximum amount of benefit from what is the existing space policy. So I would like to kind of drive a tangent to the fact that whether we should look at it or not. We should ask for what won't happen. A large part of our work, and even Abhishek here, has been in the media and telecom sector. We've been wanting a singular regulator for a very long time. It's not happened, and that's not going to happen. What couldn't happen is that every regulator which has a interdict with the other will speak to the other beforehand and speak to the industry beforehand. And for that to happen, I think there are two things that are important. One, obviously, the bureaucracy speaks to each other, which I think is doing, and Mr. Jain being here and the general attendance from the government is testimony to the fact. But what is also important is that the private sector must come together and look at issues which are industry issues rather than looking for personal private issues within that larger industry piece. So I think space and the policy there is currently in that stage where the entire ecosystem has to come together, and where lawyers, accountants, consultants, everybody can work together on that. But it's important to and I'll kind of wind this story down, to identify the issues where space can help, and I don't think there's an exhaustive list yet. Second, once we have that list of issues which the space can address and help, people, stakeholders from those areas need to come back and discuss that. And so events like this, these can't only happen in Bangalore, Delhi, Bombay. It then has to go down right up to the panchayat level, because at the panchayat level, people need to realize what they can get out of this. And thirdly, once we have all that, everybody here should sit together and figure out how their respective statutes and their respective departments can benefit from a larger space policy, and then and only then would the next level bill/regulation be effective. So that's where I'll stop. I think I'll let everybody else fill in.
Thank you, Kaushik. I now go on to Shivaji Chatterjee. Sir.
Thank you. Mr. Ismail gave a definition of watershed. I thought it's because of all the water we shed to get to this point. We've been providing services, Seema mentioned the first foreign satellite capacity, but even when we started services in February '95 with Intelsat satellites, and today We have the latest generation of the GSAT, HTS satellites that we provide service. But, you know, in India, it's one of the most challenging markets. It's very price conscious society, and with telcos like Reliance, Airtel, BSNL connecting every corner of the country, what Nathan put as the #1 application of the Super 7, it's not easy to get to. It's a market which the rural economy is very, even more price conscious, and the reach, as we all know, go anywhere, length and breadth of the country, you get a mobile service and more often than not, a 4G service. So in that kind of context, this space policy coming in was very much needed. It's better late than never, but it is late. And, you know, as we saw different technologies come up around the world, whether it's HTS technologies giving much higher bandwidth, much better cost per bit. That's what you need to compete in a market like India. And we are also very eagerly waiting for the space policy to manifest in actually practical approvals and deployments. It's been 3 years since it was announced by the finance minister, and you know, it's still at this stage when, you know, the initial draft of the guidelines are on. And I'll say the opportunity will pass us by if we don't act faster. We are very lucky, I'll say, as an industry, that the non-geo constellations of LEOs and MEOs are now getting deployed around the world. OneWeb, Starlink, Kuiper, O3B, all of these are providing global service. And I can tell you, most of the foreign operators here passed India by in terms of capacity deployment because there was no market access or no certain market access. And hence, satellites were not designed with India footprints. When we go to different events and shows, you see the satellite operators, and India-like footprint is there, but it's covering Indonesia, or it's covering Middle East or Africa. And then you know that capacity was designed for the country, but moved somewhere else. So with the GSO, non-GSO, by default, the latest constellations are available over India, not by design, but by default, because the constellations cover every part of the world. So I'll say that's an opportunity. OneWeb and Starlink are operational globally, and I'd advise if InSpace can get us, it's like getting onto a 4G or 5G bandwagon as soon as it's available. It'll be absolutely important for us to get there so that we can enable whatever is the remaining unserved market of the country. That market is shrinking very fast. It's a few percentage of India which are still unserved. And because while we say broadband connections as a, you know, and say that so many million households, that's really not the right figure. The economics are very different in India. It's a mobile-first economy. And today, that's how all the telcos and every citizen of India, and most of you in this audience, are looking at your mobile phone so actively, because that's the penetration which is there in the country. I was at the G20 summit on Thursday, Friday in Bangalore, the space economy leadership meet. And it was just fantastic to see not just the 140 Indian startups which have come up in the last few years, but startups from all around the world present. And truly, it's a very vibrant ecosystem. I think the change from, you know, we all used to say it's not rocket science. And rocket science was a metaphor for something very, you know, deep tech. But I see the whole space field changing from that rocket science, scientist and technology definition to a space economy, which is enabling. I see definitely from a government and, you know, few countries running the space around the world. There were G20 and there were many other invitees from South Asia. There were so many countries talking about space, so many private players. I think that's the true transformation which is there in terms of democratization of space. And I think that's the very interesting part, which I feel the real definition of watershed moment, it's going to really enable all these things, both in the larger picture and for SATCOM companies like us to actually go and provide services in the unserved market. Today, they are not being served, and the more we delay in coming out with policy changes, even the policy is today also a bit subjective in nature, sir. It's, it says that the criteria for financial, technical is not very clear. The Make in India, while there's some prescription, it's not easy for many of the already deployed constellations or satellites to adapt to that. So I'll say that at least in an initial period, there needs to be a kind of transition so that later on, when the ecosystem is more ready to have these criteria deployed, then we can really look at that. Thank you.
When I mentioned about the standard operating procedures, what I meant was that the beautiful policy document that has been created, it is eventually going to get into a zone where it is consisting of thousands of pages. Not for everybody's consumption, but a few hundred pages for each sector's consumption. And one thing that I found was missing, although the word national security used in it encompasses it, but the fact is that data is quite crucial when it comes to both SATCOM and remote sensing. And the security of data is something that needs to be highlighted. And perhaps in the coming days and years, we'll see a separate study being done on how to make sure that SATCOM security is ensured and remote sensing security is ensured, how data residency is ensured. And to talk more about the security of data and other aspects of it, we have with us Captain Vishal Kanwar. They've done a fabulous study last year with SIA.
Thank you so much. So, we have heard lawyers, we have heard SATCOM industry, we heard a lot on the communication domain. Let me just give you three major talking points. Firstly, what is this policy going to do in the Indian space ecosystem? Secondly, what are the challenges and what do we see ahead? Today, India is about $8 billion space economy. We are about 2% of the world global space economy. If you want to multiply it to 4 times, as a consultant, I see this policy is setting the edifice or the foundation for that. The challenge is, what will it take to implement this policy? How do you connect the dots? I think that's the biggest challenge. I think what this policy has done is what happened in US with NASA or Europe in ESA about 20 to 30 years back. The concept of new space, where a space agency becomes an enabler, a facilitator, a partner focused on core R&D, core deep space research, and the ecosystem, both public and private, come in and do the manufacturing and everything. Now let's look at it from the entire space value chain. Let's start with upstream. If you look at the upstream in satellite manufacturing, in launch vehicle manufacturing, as a country, we are taking baby steps. We had Skyroot, which just put a rocket in the air, but we have a long way to go. Similarly, in satellite manufacturing, we have Anand Technologies, so we interact with a lot of private companies as consultants. We are there, but we are not. This policy changes the game. Now, any NG, non-government enterprise, could get into upstream satellite and launch vehicle manufacturing. Now, let's come to the midstream. If you look at the ground segment, I will not comment on the communication part because a lot of my panelists have spoken about it. Look at the Earth observation. We don't have a single private entity or a public sector running an Earth observation ground segment in the country as of now. This policy changes that. Now, we are going to have, it allows private companies to run ground segments. And when we say ground segment, both TTC, satellite control, uplink, downlink for Earth observation. A huge shift. Let's come to the downstream. Communication, again, I'll hold my horses. If you look at Earth observation, I think as a country, this is one segment which benefits close to we did a back of envelope calculation about 16 sectors, agriculture, insurance, banking. The 1.4 billion people in the country would benefit the most from Earth observation, whether it is hyperspectral imaging, panchromatic, multispectral imaging, etc. This policy lays down that up to 5-meter resolution, The government will provide free and open data for common mankind in the country. And that's a huge commitment the government is taking. Now, how do you translate it into implementation is a challenge, gentlemen. And that's what we need to see, how you connect the dots. Imagine a farmer in India or an insurance or banking sector in India has access to this, free and open access to this kind of Earth observation data. It's a game changer. Come to navigation. We have our own Navig constellation in the air. We just launched another one. Again, what will it take for Indian companies to use Navig, which to our assessment is far more accurate in the Indian conditions than probably the GPS or the GLONASS or the other Galileo, etc. So essentially what I'm saying is that this policy across the value chain of space has added a new dimension on how private and public sector can participate. But the problem is that what are the challenges we see in this policy implementation? And I think there are 4 or 5 challenges which we need to overcome. How do you bring investments in the country? We spoke about some of the FDI policy, etc. But how do you excite investors? And I think exciting investors is also by having stable policies, by ensuring the policy is implemented. I think the most important part is how do you create demand? Now, demand generation in the country is something which needs to be seen both from the government side and the private side. Whilst a farmer is not perhaps willing to pay today even 1 rupee for access, for satellite imagery, for crop productivity or precision farming, but maybe the government can do a push and put some satellites in the air. What will it take for us to understand the satellites in the air are infrastructure? Just like the infrastructure gets a lot of subsidies from the government, maybe the satellites in the air can get subsidies as infrastructure. And that infrastructure, that platform can be created for the common man to access it and benefit the citizen in the country. I think ecosystem creation is another area. We know today there's a space park coming close to Tuticorin in Kulsharipatnam. Similarly, maybe there is a space park ecosystem in the north also required. Skilling, training, what can we do in increasing the number of, we rely completely on ISRO today. Most of the startups, if you do a scan in India, the core is coming from ISRO scientists. How do we have more capability in the country in all the 3 domains of Earth observation, communication, and navigation, especially in the downstream? Of course, upstream matters as well, in creating skilling and training. And I think the last is how do you look at creating the entire value chain from R&D to system integration to AIT, etc. So I would just end by saying that it's an excellent policy. This is a policy which lays down the framework for a country. I would dare say probably US and European Union did a similar thing 20 to 30 years back. We are at that cusp. We are at that inflection point. The challenge is, what will it take for us to connect the dots and create a roadmap of converting this policy and implementing it in the same spirit?
Abhishek, last word for you.
Yeah, thanks, Professor Giri. As a lawyer, a community which people usually don't like, we began and we are ending. The first word and the last word, as Professor Giri just said. Look, as lawyers love ambiguity. We thrive on it, right? So when we look at any document that is going to lay down the roadmap for an industry, which is as important as the space sector, we always look at it with the jaundiced eyes of seeing where the ambiguities lie and where it is that we will be in business, right? So, you've heard from this panel what the space policy is about, the nitty-gritties of it. You've heard from the business people as to what they were looking for in a document like this, the technical aspects of this, the consultants. What remains for me to add is very little, but I'll just try to quickly summarize it. The first part is that it is not just this policy document that was released in April which sets out the contours of policy relating to space. I think the first document that one can really look at in terms of the regulatory scenario was the, the maritime and in-flight connectivity rules that were notified in 2018, which also, there was a precursor of the TRAI consultation process to that, and that really sort of kicked off the so-called reforms in this sector. I have heard Mr. Chatterjee mention something about the fact that, we don't want this opportunity to pass us by, and whereas, it's better that we do have a policy, but it's delayed. But what we must remember, and I don't hold a brief for the government here, but what we must remember is that in May or June of 2020 is when the announcement was made by the finance minister, and we really had a first document. Of course, it's undergone changes, but we had a first document by the end of October, a draft policy, a Spacecom policy, which was followed up by 7 other documents to look at different aspects of this ecosystem. Yes, it is something that required a lot of inputs from the various actors that were contributing to and were already part of this ecosystem. And that's perhaps the reason why it has taken this time. But I hear you, Mr. Chatterjee, that this is now is the time, having had this foundation in place, for us to really speed up things. And I think one of the indications of that is that between April, when this policy was released, and now in the first week of July, we already have certain draft guidelines in place of how to make certain implementations of this, at least vis-a-vis reauthorizations are concerned. So I think the speed with which we are moving is reflective of the excitement that the industry is showing in terms of the response to this, to the policy document. Yes, there is certainly a lot that needs to be done, even with regard to the policy. What does a policy do? A policy is required to enable. Does this document do that? Certainly. I think everyone on this panel has said that there is certainly that level of enablement which perhaps was missing earlier. What is the second aspect? Ensure competition. Does this policy document create an environment, an ecosystem of a possible competitive scenario to be created amongst not just the bigger players who are already present in the international scenario, but also the vibrant ecosystem? I think a part of that answer will probably come when we have the FDI policy in place, because this is a sector that requires a substantial amount of investment, and the experience that international companies have already brought into bear for the last 2 or 3 decades that they've been working on this will certainly help the Indian ecosystem to also develop. The third aspect is longevity. Does this policy create the roadmap that this sector is not just looking at it from a short-term perspective, but it will continue to prosper, and what the national telecom policy did 3 decades ago and what we are seeing the benefit of, which is the democratization of the services, accessibility of the services to the last mile, and the proliferation of that services. Someone mentioned 16 sectors that are going to be impacted. There's telemedicine, there's insurance, there's agriculture. There is a host of not just economic but social benefits that are going to flow into the economy. Does this policy document enable that? It sows the seeds for that. But certainly, as everyone has been saying, and I echo that, there is a fair amount of stuff to be done, and I think we are all working towards that. Thank you.
So we have another 25 minutes, and in these 25 minutes, what we'll do is, we'll open up for Q&A now, and once the Q&A is done, we'll give our speakers a minute or two for their closing remarks and their recommendations. And then we'll give the microphone to our chair, who will sum up all the observations that he's gathered in this particular session. So I'm looking for 4 questions. Yes.
Should I go first? Okay. So this question is for Dr. Jain. Dr. Jain, my name is Susmita Mohanty. I've been in the professional space world for over 25 years. I began with NASA and Boeing in the late 90s, and then I've started 3 companies over these years. So I think I was one of 3 people that Dr. Vijay Raghavan had brought in for giving inputs in July of 2020 Dr. Sivan, Pavan Goenka and I were invited just before InSpace was, the framework was in place, but we were putting together InSpace. So one of my questions is, we've waited long enough, how come we still don't have a legal directorate within InSpace? Because I think having a space lawyer with extensive experience is sort of step one when a country lays down its space policy. So how come the legal directorate is missing?
Yeah. Yeah, it's very important that we should have the legal directorate. In fact, we had started the process of recruiting and establishing the legal directorate. There were certain difficulties in terms of the necessary sanctions, approvals, because the lawyers, the compensation is way beyond the what government can compensate as per the rules and whatever. So we are trying to sort it out, but in the meantime, the work has not stopped, and we are taking the consultant services, going outside and taking the legal opinion. And as you know that as far as InSpace is concerned, it started functioning. It has started issuing the authorization with the help of the consultancy from the league.
Is there anyone like Harish Sarve who would take 1 rupee? Yeah, Pranav, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm Pranav Satyanath. I'm a research associate at the Council for Strategic and Defense Research. I work on space policy issues, mostly international cooperation and domestic issues. So all of the speakers, to some extent, mentioned competition and especially conflict of interest in ISRO. But when ISRO has a small satellite launch vehicle that can compete with the same launch vehicles like Skyroot and Agnikul, during the transition period, what are the risks? And we're not just talking about launch vehicles. What are the risks when it comes to distribution of satellite imagery if ISRO wants to commercialize? So my first part of the question is, how will InSpace deal with such issues where distribution might conflict with ISRO's own interest? And second, for the broader consultants, what are the risks that you see?
So I'm not clear about your second question. Hello. Can you repeat your second question? But in the meantime, I will answer your first question. I don't think there is going to be a conflict of interest, because InSpace is going to be an autonomous entity, and the policy also enables or rather provides the level playing field to the private sector. As far as the specific question of ISRO's SSLV and then the other private players developing their own launch vehicles, InSpace has been given mandate to make and approve the launch manifesto, taking into account the requirements of the private as well as the government players. And we have, in fact, have started doing the preparation of launch manifesto, and we will see or ensure that the requirements of all the entities, be it private or government, are met.
Thank you very much for the clarification, sir. My question was for the consultants and the lawyers about what risks they see when both ISRO and the commercial sector have competing interests.
I'll try to address that, and subject to what other people's inputs are. See, at the end of the day, when you're talking about laying down the foundation or a roadmap that impacts a sector, it's not specific to, of course, it's creation of enough opportunities and level playing field for the private sector as well, because the public sector has already been there. But it's not exclusive. It should not work in a manner so as to exclude the public sector completely. If the public sector is also in a position to be able to compete, then so be it, and that's how it should be. I mean, even when the National Telecom Policy came out, it's not as if MTNL or BSNL just sort of faded into oblivion, right? So they were also competing with the private sector. The important part is to create and ensure that level playing field so that the private sector, which has till now not got the same opportunities or access, should be enabled to do that. But it should not be to the exclusion of the public sector. So, I mean, there will be, that's for the policymakers to ensure, the regulators to ensure that that discrimination does not take place. And in any case, I mean, that's guaranteed by Article 14 of our Constitution. So, I personally don't see too much of a risk in that.
Yeah, so just to add to what he's saying is, between ISRO and the industry, the policy attempts to clarify that. It says any technology which ISRO develops, which is operational and matured. So, for example, you heard the recent news, the SSLV is a small satellite launch vehicle. A mature technology is what is operationalized within ISRO. That technology will be handed over to the industry. So therefore, there is an attempt to very clearly categorize what ISRO will continue doing, which is R&D, deep space research, which is human space flight, in-orbit research, etc. But any technology which gets operationalized, in other words, the demonstration is over, the technology is mature, the policy says that that technology will be handed over to the industry. It could be public or private sector. So I think the policy is attempted to clarify that.
Devlina?
Hello. Yeah. Hi, I'm Devlina from Numerate. I represent the startup ecosystem, especially the downstream sector. So one of you, I think Mr. Kaushik mentioned that now that the draft has come, we'll be gathering issues from various sectors. But I believe there was a very, I think 2 days, 3 days meet, and Chaitanya was part of it last year sometime in Chennai, where upstream, midstream, and downstream sectors collaborated, collected issues, and how we can go about solving it. And this has been done in the past. Like if you really look up articles on news, we have really talked about the problem with data access. So I'm a little surprised that when it comes to downstream sector, we're just talking about the high resolution data, but there's not much clarity on the data access, and not at least the initial starting thoughts of how to really have a up and running business application, access ISRO data so that it doesn't have to really, and how can you access, typically ESA or NASA provides those access. So any thoughts on that, or anything that is currently being done about that?
Sure, that's the question to me. I'm happy to be referenced in your question, but never mind. I think my view on that is that I think there's enough consultation that's started to happen. Consultation is never enough, and we will never know. And space is just one of those sectors. We've seen telecom going the same way. We've seen broadcasting going the same way. So the idea is to have as much as we can have, and then work on it on different drafts. But I would again reiterate that we should now post the policy, and which is why I said after the policy there are these consultations. We should wait possibly for the draft bill before we really can pass judgment on whether the bill or the policy encompasses everybody's views or not. I think I would stick to what I said. It's premature, but it's a step in the right direction. Thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Amandeep Singh from Ministry of Defense, Government of India. My question to Dr. Jain is, as we all know, the NGs will be dealing with the predicted analysis of the space environment and the operational environment once they are in the conduct of satellite business and all. So these involve the national interest. So how in space will be taking care of the security aspects once the NGs are involved in the security and the touching upon the national interest?
Yeah, thank you for this question, and it's very pertinent, the security aspect. And in fact, you might have seen in the policy also, the enough emphasis has been given to the national security. And here I would also like to reply to respond to some of the comments made by Ms. Seema, that actually in fact the guidelines which we have released as a draft seeking the inputs, some of the points are keeping in mind the security aspect like the satellite configuration. When you change the satellite configuration, or when you bring the replacement satellite, if it is not exactly of the same configuration, it has to be assessed from the security point of view, and the data security, which again Professor Chaitanya was talking about, that considerations are important. We have brought out the internal guidelines where the security aspects are addressed while we assess any application seeking the authorization for the operation and establishment of the satellite, be it remote sensing or the communication satellite. And even for the security of the data, which is of less than 30 centimeter GSD, of course, that is very critical from the security aspect. And again, the dissemination of that data, the encryption required on board, all those points have been addressed in our guideline, which we have released. So we do certainly have a very important one of the criteria for assessing the authorization application.
Scope for last question. Anybody? Yes, sir.
Thank you. My name is Colonel Virender, and I really appreciate the discussions that happened. My question is there any body or is it the mandate of InSpace to take the private industry to the global environment in terms of business? And what is the likely time frame when we're going to have a Indian SpaceX kind of company?
So yeah, it's a good question which everyone asks. As far as the body which would take us our Indian industry to the global, it's InSpace. InSpace, one of the mandates is certainly to have the international outreach, and we have been working towards that. We have been making a lot of conference, and then especially even if G20, that SLAM meeting was there recently in Bangalore, we had one entire session which was conducted by InSpace, connecting the startups and industry of the other countries to the Indian industry. So when SpaceX type of thing, yes, that let us hope so. We are seeing a lot of activities now in the country, and let us see that some of the startups reach to that particular level. Thanks to the efforts of government, the initiative by InSpace, Department of Space, ISRO, and of course the industry, which has to play a major role.
Just wanted to add to that, because of the experiences that one also has had over the last 7 or 8 years that I've been working in this area. And I think you must have also heard somewhere that in the G20 space dialogue that was held a little while ago last week, there were 140 startups attending that. So that in itself is indicative of the amount of time, effort, investment, and talent that is already available to the space ecosystem from India. And I don't think the time is far when that's going to happen. The other is, just wanted to finish off with this nugget of information. I've been attending this international conference called Satellite, which takes place in Washington, D.C. every year since 2016. And on day 2 of that conference, there is a fairly high-powered presentation made by one of the research entities called Northern Sky Research on the situation within the space ecosystem in the last 5 years, etc. Between 2016 and 2022, there was, in none of the briefings that I attended, there was even a mention of India. This time, in March, I was there, India was mentioned 5 times. So I think certainly we've already made a mark, and that will continue to happen.
Okay, quickly, 2 bullet points each. Sriram.
Thank you. See, add on to the question that the gentleman asked in terms of when do we find the next SpaceX in India, and then also add on to what my colleague talked about. It's much like the IT sector, and we are seeing a real boom One observation that I have is in Indian IT sector, we have produced Infosys, TCS, Tech Mahindra, Wipro, so on and so forth. But probably we have fallen short of producing the next FANG or some of the product companies specifically in India. So the core research, the core productization of some of the most critical components of this particular value chain. If I look at it, we've been talking a lot about downstream data. We've been talking a lot about companies doing AIT. We've been talking a lot about some kind of launch vehicles. But the core, the payload, the sensor, the most critical component that aids Earth observation, perhaps some kind of international collaboration, international dialogue that InSpace or others can aid in terms of bringing that technology into India or some kind of technology transfer kind of approaches would really catalyze and make us much more Atmanirbhar in this particular sector is what I feel. Thank you.
Mr. Ismail?
All spectrum is not alike. Spectrum that's used for INT is exclusive spectrum. So there is maybe some risk, and there has been a historical case of corruption with the 2G case. That is not the case with satellite spectrum, which is shared. So multiple operators can use the spectrum, so there is less risk of any corruption. And in fact, trying to auction that spectrum is not very feasible. And I'm really hoping that when the administrative allocation is made, the DOS will challenge TRAI on this question of whether spectrum should be auctioned for satellite services.
Captain Vishal?
Thank you. I think it's an excellent start with the space policy. What is left is how do we convert this policy into implementation roadmap? The question of what to do, when to do, and how to do it. And towards that end, I think if we look at all the three areas, upstream is where India can, with our understanding of a private ecosystem and the capabilities we have, we could be a global satellite manufacturing hub. We could look at heavy launch vehicles to medium launch vehicles, which are going to put a lot of LEO satellites in the air. In the midstream, how can we take more and more ground segments privatization? Today, companies like Leo Labs, etc., are doing complete midstream segment. There's no government involved in EO midstream in most of the parts in Europe and US. And I think one of the things I want to stress is the bang for the buck is in the downstream. There is a lot of glamour in the upstream on launch vehicles and satellite manufacturing, but the margins are thin there. The bang for buck is in the downstream. How do we invigorate the Indian ecosystem, the space ecosystem, in investing in Earth observation, communication, and navigation? That's where the margins are, and that's where you have the maximum impact. Societal impacts, economic impacts, and also strategic impacts for the country.
Shivaji?
Yeah, there's a popular phrase in the Indian SATCOM industry called open skies. And it's not the type which has been happening last 2 days here, but it's about enabling anyone to do business in SATCOM or space in the country and supply meeting demand. And I think by and large in space and the space policies, trying to build that framework of doing it in the current geopolitical and given the legacy and what kind of future. So I understand the balancing act, and definitely there is demand, and by enabling this kind of environment, the supply can come in to meet that demand. And that demand is something which is penetrating down to the common man and to help include the rural economy with the mainstream. The other element in today with the kind of innovation, and we've seen, the IT and pharma industry and what young Indian engineers and minds can do. I feel with that kind of excitement in the space industry, this 140 startups can multiply and really become many big companies, just like we didn't imagine it in the tech and pharma space, but it's a reality. And it's going to happen in the space industry because we've come late to the party. And I think that supply can help create demand, not just fulfill it. Thank you.
Very quickly, I think with the way forward, the first aspect is perhaps a greater amount of cooperation and dialogue between the various ministries within the government. So One of the aspects that Sherille mentioned was the the question of administrative allocation or auctioning of spectrum, and that's where InSpace and US perhaps will play a bigger role to be able to convince DOT, TRAI, and the consultation process that is currently ongoing that it is distinct from terrestrial network. Perhaps there is no need to treat it the same way. So that's one in terms of cooperation. There is another bit of conflict that also does exist between in the in-flight sort of connectivity area with the technology that is being deployed in other aircraft across other parts of the world. There are certain issues with the CAR, the regulations under the Aircraft Act, which is being implemented by the DGCA, which could create a problem. So these roadblocks need to be removed. And the second most important aspect is, yes, the policy is a great starting document, but the specific rights and liabilities can only be thrashed out in a legislation so that there is greater amount of clarity amongst the industry as to what exactly to expect when they are entering into this area. Thank you.
Thank you. So we've covered a lot of ground in terms of having a stable policy, but I think the key in thriving any industry in the market space is confidence. And that's what I saw when 1991 policy came. The confidence that the government gave to the private industry was the key, was I would say the reason, the watershed reason for people to come and invest in India in terms of FDIs. So coming to the space policy regime, I think what we need to possibly have more space is into how is the data that is generated and made by the startups or the private industry, how is that protected? The space policy is not covering that bit, but the Space Activity Bill has touched upon it very, very briefly. And one of the concerning bits there is that all data will be protected as per law, but any data that is generated outside of in outer space by space object will belong to central government. So that's a debate that needs to be looked at. Second is the dispute resolution processes. I think the confidence of the industry will come into any sector, be that be a space or manufacturing or anything else, is how quick and the dispute redressal, the concerns that the space industry has with the government, with the courts, or with anybody, how quickly and effectively and easily they are sort of settled and resolved. I think the buoyancy of any industry is based on the effective legal systems and enforcement rights there. So that's another very important aspect. And I would also add that the data technology, the technology transfers that ISRO has already mentioned in the space policy, it's a step in the right direction because ISRO for the first time is now open to share its technology with the startups. Now, how that will play out, how that would be implemented, it's something that we need to see. But that's another area that would be very, very handy when it comes to startups in terms of already availing the technology which has already been developed and are mature. Thank you.
I think everything's been covered mostly, but I'll just say that nothing succeeds like business. And only when more and more possibly quote-unquote non-space sector companies can see that they can also contribute to the industry, to the space industry and make money out of it, is when the industry will actually kind of boom and take shape. I mean, just to give an example, there are enough men and women in uniform sitting in this audience at the moment, and all of those who've been a fusilier at some point would know that a large part of the payload and the delivery there too is actually controlled by a fuse, which is not made by a gun company. It's made by an electronics manufacturing or an automotive manufacturing company. So that's where the opportunity lies, really. I mean, the space sector, we need to move out, go lateral, and everybody should be able to make money as part of that sector. That's all. Thank you.
So I hand over to chair of the session, sir.
Thank you, Professor Chaitanya, for moderating this session very nicely. Excuse me. One thing has come out very clearly now with all these discussions and views by the experts here, that the government intentions are very clear. It has given us a very good platform by setting out this policy. And now important thing is that we have to take it forward. everyone has to work together and see that where we can take it from here. Especially the industry, all the government departments. Especially important thing is, which was mentioned by one of the speakers, is that there is a need to now for all the government department to tune their policy or optimize their policy to be in sync with this Indian space policy. And that process has already started. In fact, Department of Telecommunication has already set out a task team to now identify and start implementing and tuning their licenses. They have already also sought the inputs from the industry also in this regard. So that is one important point. The other important point came is about the guidelines which in space has released and sought the inputs. Some of the things like the authorization is limited to the satellite operational life, or even the non-compliance to any of the licensing condition renders the authorization null and void. All these suggestions, of course, inputs have been received. In space, will certainly examine the comments and inputs and do appropriately whatever changes are required, will surely adopt. But at the same time, the important thing here is space being considered now as a fourth frontier. It's very important now from the security and strategic point of view. There are international commitments, international relations, geopolitical considerations, security aspect. There are many other things which are involved here. So the things would not be as simple as in any other license or authorization. So we have to keep those things also in mind. We will do our level best to accommodate the inputs. 4.5 months time is too bit high. There is observation, but again, that is not for all types of authorization. Certain category of authorization requires more inputs from the various other government departments, and that takes time. Of course, we are also trying to speed up, expedite the things. We have one committee, interministerial committee for the coordination among the department, and that committee as a single window reviews all the authorization application. There was one observation that there could be conflict of interest between DOS and ISRO, DOS being the implementation agency. Again, I do not think, of course, we have to see the guidelines, whatever are coming out very clearly. The authorization as far as guidelines are concerned, they are being brought out by InSpace, which has been mandated to act as a autonomous body, independent entity, and the level playing field to the private players is one of the emphasis in the Indian space policy. And I think that should set the tone or the intention of the government. There is one more point was related to the FDI, which is to be expedited, it is being from the different department. It is not so, though the DPIIT handles the FDI issue, but it is the concerned administrative ministry or administrative department which provides the approval. So as far as the space sector is concerned, Department of Space is the administrative ministry, and that provides the clearance for the FDI. And with the FDI revision in the space sector will certainly provide much more clarity to these aspects. There was one observation that we should expedite the NGSO usage constellation in the country. Let me tell you, we already have the couple of applications with us, and those applications are being examined, and we will bring up accordingly depending on the outcome of the examination. Data security, I already addressed. We are working on it. Our guidelines with respect to Earth observation data dissemination for both less than 30 centimeter and greater than 30 centimeter very adequately address this aspect. There is one more important point which is brought out by Captain Vishal, that now the important thing is that we have to connect the dots now. And that I think all of us agree here. How do we start implementing the policy? The guidelines have to come up out very fast. Let me tell you again that we are not waiting for the guidelines to come out or approve. InSpace has started already functioning. We have already started issuing the authorization, and that is the reason even some of the guidelines only we could bring it out, which are right now important, where we are seeing lot of applications are coming up. But in parallel, we are also working on the guidelines for the other authorization, and which will be keep as and when we draft it, we will be keep bringing it out, seeking the inputs from the industry. And hopefully very soon, the entire guideline and SOPs, the detailed SOP will come out. Of course, we already have got our internal SOP approved by the government and by our board, and as per that SOP only we have started functioning, and there is an SOP between the coordination between the ISRO and InSpace, especially to facilitate the NGEs for the usage of the ISRO facilities and the technical expertise. Technology transfer was an important point which was raised. We already have got the SOP now for technology transfer, how the ISRO technologies would be made accessible to the private players. And InSpace would be a single window interface for the technologies. InSpace will identify the technologies which are available with ISRO, which can be made accessible to private entities. Even the private entity who are desiring to take the technology, particular technology from ISRO, can approach InSpace, can apply to it, and InSpace will take it up with ISRO and make that technology accessible. So with that comments, I thank all the fellow distinguished speakers and all the delegates for the patient listening and providing the valuable inputs on the this very important subject, Indian Space Policy 2023. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, sir. And ladies and gentlemen, with that, once again, let's put our hands together for the wonderful session that we had. It was knowledgeable, interactive, and thanking all our eminent speakers, chair and the moderator, we now close the proceedings of this session, inviting everyone to kindly join us for lunch. We would like to inform that the lunch for eminent speakers and VIPs will be served outside this hall at the Oval, and for all our delegates, lunch is arranged at the Regency Ballroom. You may kindly join us for lunch at the respective areas, and the next session will begin at 14:30 hours, that is 2:30 p.m., requesting everybody to be seated back in time. Thank you.